it tastes sweeter. There's a bit more density to the finished product to it, and as the fruit is just so ridiculously fresh at that point, and you're not weighing it down with additional sugar. I mean, it tastes. I've got a couple recently that they really taste amazing without any added sugar after stabilization. But it's not. I haven't been able to do it for all of them. Some of them you measure it and it does not have enough residual sugar in it to taste right. So you're adding another 4 or 8 points of gravity in honey just to get the viscosity to the point where it tastes right. But it certainly can be done with going dry and building it back up. But I tell people to be careful about how far you go with the sweetness, especially if it's low alcohol. It just can't handle it. It's designed to be lighter, and once you go too far back sweetening a lighter beverage, you'll taste it. You'll taste how unbalanced it is, and it's just all unfermented sugar, and that's all you're tasting, and it just no longer tastes pleasant. Let's see. What other questions? Oh, yeast. We haven't talked about yeast yet.
No, we have not. I'm all excited.
Now you're hitting on Manny's. Now you're hitting on all Manny's cylinders.
Yep. Well, and it's a good question every time you talk about a different type of recipe, because there are definitely yeast out there that work, in different ways. With Cizer, I always recommend Lalvin 71B. And
really?
There's a key reason why. It will metabolize more malic acid than other similar types of white wine yeasts. Malic acid is the dominant acid in apples. So essentially what you're doing is a pseudo-malolactic fermentation.
Interesting.
Softening up the acidity in it. Now, you have to want to do that, because you may be looking for a cider that is very acid driven. Some dry, very, very good ciders benefit from having a good deal of acid because it maintains that real crisp, really sharp profile to it. I tend to like mine a little bit softer. So that's why I use 71B on a lot of my apple fermentations, just because I feel like the 10 or 20% additional malic acid it metabolizes, it just makes the result just a little bit more round. And again, when you're looking to potentially back sweeten or, go to stop at a fairly low amount of residual sugar, that reduction in acid is aiding you because you need less sugar to perceive the sweetness.
I agree totally with what you're saying, but I'd also like for our listeners to add a balancing factor to that. I find that oftentimes when I taste somebody's mead and I find out what yeast they've used, I think one of the things that happens against 71B's favor, so to speak, is that I find too many times people using 71B don't end up with a good balance at the end of the day, and it's oftentimes kind of flabby and boring, and because the 71B has done some work on the acids, and I've often found that if they would have considered that and done something to bring the acid back a little bit, maybe that they could take something that, in other words, a lot of times when I taste meads made with 71B, I think they could use a little bit of help with some acids. And so I think it's important for our listeners to understand that there's always, with any mead, we've got to work towards making a good balance.
Yeah, and for those desserts, so back to those dessert apple ciders that you might get that don't have a lot of really robust character to them, they don't have any cider apples in them that would have additional acid. Yeah, you can certainly soften up and make a flat, relatively flabby result with those. Right. 71B, because you're further reducing the one thing that those apples will have afterwards, which is some amount of acidity to them. Now that you've stripped the sugar away. So yeah, very, very, very useful piece of information to give people an understanding that you're making a choice in doing this, and it's probably one that's best made with some experience. So try it, but try try a different yeast. If you've got 2 buckets of cider and you're not sure what you're going to do with each of them at the end, ferment them each with a different yeast. And before you do anything to them, taste them and decide which one you like, because now you're going to have a feel for, if I got that cider again, which yeast would I use, based on the outcome that I actually enjoyed.
I would say I'm not like you where I can buy a whole bunch of different species of apples right off the tree or, in a tub. In other words, I usually have to start with boring ciders that I already know are going to need a lot of help. I think that cysers are probably, in my opinion, they're the most difficult category of a mead to get right, because you've got to have the sweetness, you've got to have the tart, you've got to have the bitter, and you've got to have the astringent, and you have to have all 4 of those. They don't have to all be equal in comparison, but you have to have each component. You have to have those 4 fractions at work, all in the proper balance, in my opinion, to really have a great cider, and that's the difficulty in making good cisers. So with that in mind, if you're stuck like I am buying crap cider at the grocery stores as your base, I would suggest to some people you might want to try using DV10, because that will give some of the acidic notes that you're not going to find when you're just using these, quote, drinking ciders for Halloween. So I think that's also a good choice, along with K1B if you like K1B esters, because they kind of lend themselves to that kind of cider piece.
I'm kind of agreeing exactly with what you're saying, because it's you've got all those things that you mentioned to get right in honey, and you also have to get them right on the apple juice. And man, it's hard enough to get one right, and now you got to get it right on both counts, and then the balance of honey to apple juice is another issue that you have to get going, which honestly for me makes making a good cider that much more satisfying when you actually are able to do it, which is great.
Yeah.
I'm going to do the Verizon. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, you're there.
Okay,
yeah,
good.
I
have no idea. No idea what you had.
Yeah.
And it wasn't all the sound went away. It was almost like the call dropped, but like you said, I was still on. So, okay,
Yeah.
good. Yeah, I mean, other yeasts. I mean, I've used some other things for cider. I've used QA23. I've actually made a couple of really nice cisers with lager yeast.
Interesting.
Obviously, I'm doing lager yeast with its intended temperature range, so I've actually I have a
so it's cold.
Yeah, so like low 50s, and relatively small batches, because I wasn't sure what was going to happen, and I didn't want to waste a ton of cider, on it. But mixed up the honey and the cider, put it in a small carboy, put it out on my bulkhead late in the season, and it kind of stays through mid-December. It'll stay in the 50s or so there, because it's basically just a concrete box that's got a stairway in it that heads out to the back patio. And if you keep it closed up good, and man, it ended up having these incredible aromas. Now I haven't been able to reproduce it, so there's more going on there than just the yeast. But if you think about what lager yeast is intended to do, cooler ferment, nice crisp, clean profile to it. It was worth the experiment, because I generated a batch of mead from it that I really enjoyed.
Interesting.
Well, others, folks have mentioned, champagne yeast, Premier Cuvée, SO5, K1V. All of them will do a great job on cider, because for the most part they're designed for the fermentation of some type of wine, in a lot of cases white wines, and cider, if you think about it, is pretty much a white wine made from honey and apples. Your outcome, if it's not sweet, is pretty much going to be like a dry white wine.
Right. From the little bit of research that I've done on cider, I think I always ask, do people blend yeast, this and that. I've noticed that in the cider community, there's a lot of, not necessarily yeast blending, but one of the things that I've noticed is that people they'll do, if they're going to do 5 gallons of cider, they'll do 2.5 with yeast A and 2.5 with yeast B, and then blend the results afterwards. And I don't know if to me, if you're making a cyser, I think it would be interesting to try and do the same thing with a cyser, maybe, breaking them up, seeing what a lager yeast will do when mixed with maybe an ale yeast or a Belgian, that kind of thing. Have you tried doing any of that stuff or no? Have you?
Yes, I have. And I'm about to post a link in the chat to the Tarula Spora del Brucchi. So WLP 603, so White Labs. It's actually came out of their vault.
I've already clicked on it.
2015, and it was isolated from fruit trees in Denmark, and they actually have a WLP 611, which is I believe it's a blend that they made for cider. So I heard about this at NHC in 2016 and bought some out of the vault, and it's not designed for a full attenuation, so it does need to be fermented with something else. So I actually did it on a Cizer earlier this year. I actually got some early season apples from a family in the next town over. They published it on one of the local Facebook pages for the town and said, hey, we've got these kind of light green apples on a tree out front, and they're dropping like mad. We've tasted them, and they taste ripe. If anybody wants them, come get them. And I mean, this was in like early August, which was weird because it was quite early for us to have apples not only ripe but dropping off the tree too. So I went and grabbed a whole bucket of them, and I couldn't tell you what they are. I mean, they definitely tasted unique. So they're probably some type of heirloom apple that, the original owner of the house planted, and they just happened to produce pretty well this year. And so that was one where I took apple juice, honey, and these apples that I had cut, frozen, and then subsequently threw on top of this, and then use the Tarula Spora for the primary ferment, and then some QA23 to finish it. Cool. And it definitely has unique character to it, and not just from the fruit. There's definitely a unique fermentation character from it. So looking at experimenting with different types of yeasts, including ones that are maybe not necessarily designed for a full ferment, that need to be, need to have a Saccharomyces strain added afterwards or at the same time, definitely can produce some interesting results. And certainly this Tarula Spora was included in a blend that White Labs decided they wanted to market, as something that people could use for cider or for that matter, Cizer. So I think it must have a biological history of being familiar with fermenting apples. So it to me, it's worked out pretty well. I've not finished that one yet. I've let it sit. I did some oak on it, and I just need to sweeten it up just a little bit before I bottle it. But it's definitely going to be something where people are going to look at me after they taste it, going, "Okay, well, what's going on here? There's more here than just Cizer." And I'm only going to be able to tell them what was in it because I don't really know how to describe some of the other stuff. Its complexity is about the best thing I can say. Is it's got some things going on that I don't know what they're from. I don't know if it's the apples, the yeast, or both.
Interesting. That leads me to another question that I had. I hope I'm not stepping on anybody's question.
No, one question at a time, sir.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. Well, it has to do with aging, and the average time that you might want that you age these ciders or Cysers.
Anything that has got, say, 12% more alcohol in it, I would encourage people to give it, post fermentation, either bulk aging or in the bottle, to let that fermentation character mellow and integrate, but also let how much ever alcohol you've created, mellow. We've mentioned competitions a couple times in tonight's show. I am always amazed, and even with the way things are kind of changing in the front of education around here, about how prolific people seem to be in creating alcohol. And this is where I think what's probably quite likely is